Hi, guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. Is communism all that bad? That's what we're looking at in today's video. As many of you might already know, if I had to pick between the dichotomy of capitalism and communism, more often than not, I tend to pick capitalism over the latter. And the reason for this is quite obvious, right? It's because when we look at the 20th century and when we look at the results of both these economic models, the capitalist one tends to be far more successful than the communist one. And I would venture that most of you watching this video, most of you, would probably agree with me as well. I think it's almost become an intellectual consensus at this point that one has a better track record than the other. It's easy to substantiate this as well. We could look at, and I think I've mentioned this in previous videos as well, we could look at countries like North Korea, South Korea, East Germany, West Germany, and we will see clear differences. North Korea and South Korea had the same people who spoke the same language, who ate the same food, who were genetically identical. And yet, in one generation, North Korea became a cesspool of poverty, while South Korea became one of the most prosperous countries in the world. The average North Korean child is said to be a couple of inches shorter than the average South Korean child because of poverty and malnutrition and things like that, right? So think about that. We have identical communities, and in one generation, the two are completely unrecognizable. West Germany was completely unrecognizable from East Germany, despite such a short period of time the two of them had spent apart. As the saying goes, the refugees were from East to West, very rarely from West to East when we look at the German scenario. However, with all that being said, I do think there are certain defenses of communism that are still tenable in the modern world. Before I go into those, I just like to make it quite clear that I'm not coming to this from the perspective of some kind of new age communist. And what I mean by that is, many people have observed that the vast majority of the quote unquote communists in the world today are people who have the luxury of not living in a communist country. Of course, there are serious communist scholars and there are serious non-communist scholars who analyze communism as well from all over the world. This can be the communist world, the former communist world, the capitalist world, whatever. So I'm not trying to caricature that position. However, many have noted, and rightly so, that many of the communists that we see in the modern discourse today tend to be either college students or political activists who've never actually had to live under communism, even though they claim to be sort of supporters of the values of communism. So, what are some of the realistic defenses that we can possibly mount? In my judgment, there are about three, right? The first is that communism tends to have a slightly more moral angle to things than capitalism. And what I mean by that is, communism often sort of facilitates the rhetoric of justice much better than capitalism does, which is precisely why we see younger people drifting towards communism, because when we are young and when we are idealistic and when we have a certain sort of optimistic worldview where we want to change things, where things look like they're infinite and unlimited, we do tend to sort of find arguments within communism that sort of validate our views a lot better. And this is not really the case with capitalism. Of course, with capitalism, we can make arguments based on justice and ethics and things like that. But I would say that communism makes the job a lot easier. We must note, though, that fundamentally, both capitalism and communism are, I wouldn't say immoral, but amoral economic models. And what I mean by that is, morality has no real place for either one. These are both godless religions, whether it's the Ayn Rand libertarian type of capitalism or Adam Smith's invisible hand, however you want to look at it, or the kind of Marxist version of communism. Both of them are atheistic philosophies. And because of that, it's hard to use moral arguments, because there is no appeal to a higher divinity when we look at both of these, right? So keep in mind that both of them have problems when it comes to morality. However, communism tends to facilitate that discussion a lot easier. The second is that communism is also a lot more translatable because of this into other causes. So if we look at feminism, environmentalism, right, with many of those things, you will usually find that a lot of those people are closet communists. We even have a term called watermelon with environmental studies, where you're green on the outside and red on the inside. And what that means is you tend to be somebody who sort of claims to support environmental measures and all that, but deep down inside, you are a Marxist, you are a communist. And we shouldn't really take that as a criticism alone of communism. We've got to take that as a compliment as well, because it means that the malleability of the ideology makes it easy for different people from different worldviews to fit the communist viewpoint into their own agenda. And the final thing I want to defend communism about is the whole idea of, oh, capitalism breeds innovations and research and inventions and all that, while communism does nothing. But those of you who've seen my video on the inventions of the US Pentagon would know that most of the modern day-to-day technological innovations that we live with were originally created through state sponsorship, were originally created by the state itself. It wasn't some kind of invisible hand or private sector innovation or whatever. These were all done by the public sector, by government servants and government contracts, and much later on, they are transferred to the private sector, and then people exploit it and become billionaires and all that. So if you look at Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and all those guys, they are seen as innovators, they are seen as private sector billionaires. But that technology was originally subsidized by the American taxpayer from the 60s to the 80s. It was the American taxpayer who funded that research to get the government to that level. And after that, after 30 or 40 years of public sector research, once it's privatized, many of these guys came in and exploited that and became rich. So this whole notion of communism being some kind of anti-technology, anti-innovation model, I wouldn't really agree with that either. So these are the three arguments that I personally use to defend communism. This doesn't mean that I feel communism is better than capitalism. It's simply that I think the struggle is still not over and the ideology can still be sustainably advocated for. If you like videos like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.